Hey, okay, well, welcome everyone to the latest historical presentation by the Westtown Township Historical Commission. Few commercials at the beginning. We have history books about the township. In the back there, they're $20. There's some free history books, and then we have a whole book sale table from our speaker today. We're here today to talk about an event that happened not 2 miles down the road on September 11th, 1777, 247 years ago. And at that event, a young French nobleman for the first time drew his sword in support of American independence, American liberty. Our speaker today is going to talk about that young Frenchman, the consequences of his support for American liberty. And his name is Bruce Mowday. He's well known here in Chester County as an historian and an author. He used to be editor of the Daily Local back when newspapers were useful. And he's written any number of books, everything from a book about Phillies star Richie Ashburn, some crime stories, and a lot of history. Pickett's Charge, a book on Gettysburg, book on the Revolution, book on Fort Delaware. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Bruce Mowday.
Dave, thank you very much for that introduction. And I've written a lot of different books, but they all have in common are people stories. I am fascinated by real people, what they do, why they do it, the motivation, whether if it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. The true crime books that I did through my reporting as a reporter at the Daily Local News. And thank you, Dave, for saying that. Don't blame me for what happened to the newspaper industry. I left a long time ago. So I'm really interested in people and what they do. And I have a new best friend, Lafayette, who really follows me just about every place. Every time I turn around, I give a talk, there he is. And you talk about somebody that really deserves to be studied and celebrated. It's really Lafayette. We are in the midst, just started last month in New York City. And 200 years ago, 1824 and 1825, Lafayette was brought back as America's guest by President Monroe. And for 13 months, just about every day, there were parades, dinners, all kind of, people welcomed Lafayette into all 24 states because they wanted to honor him, because he was known as really the Frenchman and the American hero. And without him, we probably wouldn't have had enough aid from France to defeat the British. And so it might be God save the Queen this morning, or King, right? We're now the King this morning. So we owe a lot, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about Lafayette and what he did, as Dave said, just down the road here in the Battle of the Brandywine. This is a perfect timing, actually, for this talk. Yesterday was Lafayette's birthday. He was just turned 20 before the Battle of the Brandywine, which took place, of course, on September the 11th, 1777. I'm a member of the American Friends of Lafayette. I was at the big kickoff in New York City in August, and I was part of the parade. You can imagine they still had a parade up Broadway in honor of Lafayette, and the big celebration concluded that Saturday night with a reception that was put on by the French consulate in New York. So he's getting a lot of visibility. I think he's making his way back from Boston and New England, and the American Friends are trying to do step by step where he was on the 200th anniversary. and they've been up in New England. I think they're coming back, at the end of the month. He'll be in Philadelphia. Then he'll be in Delaware County and then Delaware. And if you want to take a look, it's Lafayette200.org is the website. But get ready, because next year, on July 26th, we are having a big celebration, because part of that tour, Lafayette was here in Chester County on that date in 1825. So we're going to kick it off at Chadsford area. We've been talking with the Brandywine Conservancy. They just preserved Birmingham Hill, and we're pretty sure that's where Lafayette was wounded on September the 11th. Then it's going to switch into Westchester, where 200 years ago, he was given a big dinner. If you go to Marshall Square Park, you'll see the stone where Lafayette stood on that day. So we are going to have our own chance to celebrate Lafayette, and I hope you all come in to take part. Well, let's kind of go back to Lafayette and who he is. Now, I know it's early morning, but we all got to get involved. Actually, I like early morning. Morning's my favorite time of the day. Think back to when you were 19 years old. Everybody there? Okay. Now, say at 19. We back online here? We're okay? He didn't know the language. He had no concept of what, freedom really meant, but it really resonated into him. Would you, as a 20-year-old, give everything up, defy your king, leave your young family to come to a foreign land to fight for their freedom? I don't think many of us would, but that's what Lafayette did. And like I said, he was honored for 13 months. He was only supposed to stay for 4 months back in 1824, but at the end of the year, when he was in DC, he said, "I'm ready to go back." And they said, "You can't go," because every state had put in a request. There was 24 of them then. And you can't go until you visited everything. So for 13 months, he was honored. Can you think of anybody today that would garner that much praise and that much attention? I don't think so. I don't think so at all, but he really deserved it all. So we're going to talk about our young Lafayette. His father died early. His father was killed in the 7 Years' War during a bombardment by the British artillery. And of course, that kind of set Lafayette. He was not a big fan of Great Britain, England at any time, of course, during his life. And you can see that kind of shaping his, both sides of his family, his mother's and father's side, were rich. They had money, they owned land, they military, history with his father's side. So there was a lot there to that family. He was brought up by his aunts and some nieces that were pretty close to his own age. And I think that is really a critical point on Lafayette as he grew up, because from the beginning, whether it hurt him privately, he ended up in prison during the French Revolution, but he wouldn't let go his ideal. And they came down to, everybody's important. Everybody should be treated equally. We should have independence and we should have freedom. It didn't matter, man, woman, black, white, Asian, it didn't matter. And he stuck with this all the way through his life. In fact, the only really big argument he ever had with George Washington, and a lot of people consider, and I think it's really close, Washington was like Lafayette's father, and Washington considered Lafayette as a son. They were really close. In fact, Lafayette's only son was named George Washington Lafayette. So, there was that closeness, but his only really fight was over slavery. And he told Washington, he told Jefferson, you really, really just need to get rid of slavery. It's wrong. It's going to hurt the country. Give it up. And what they pretty much told Lafayette, we agree with you. But did they do anything about it? Of course not. The slaves were freed after they had died. But again, Lafayette was a person of his word. After the American Revolution, he actually brought a couple of pieces of land that had slaves and the French Indies. And he did so because he wanted to free them. He started to pay them education, give them medical treatment, and was working to get them to be free in the society. Great idea. His wife, Adrienne, really helped out with it until the French Revolution. He lost all of his property, and he lost those properties in the Indies. So, he really did put what he said into effect the whole year. So we're back, young guy, father dies, mother spends a lot of time in France. He's brought up by a lot of women in the family. And at one point he comes back to France with his mother. She dies when he was very young. I think it was 12. So he is really the ward of his grandfather. And back then, you got to go back to the customs of the times. There were arranged marriages, and they weren't done for love, were they? They were done for money and power and prestige, and the family was more important than the individuals. So his grandfather arranged the marriage with Adrienne's father, because he had a number of daughters he had to find suitable husbands for, and he thought Lafayette would be a good one with his money and everything. And they were all set to do it. Adrienne's mother said, wait a minute, who's this guy Lafayette? I'm a little unsure about him. Let's spend a little time looking at him. So for a couple of years, Adrienne did not know she was engaged, but she was. Everybody grew to love Lafayette. He was a very personable character. He made friends easily. He had the good heart. He was, a lot of people say, a little bit on the naive side, the rose-colored glasses. He saw the good of everything right away, but everybody kind of loved him, and they were married very young. Now Lafayette wanted to go ahead and be following the footsteps of his father, and the first thing he did, he became a member of the Musketeers. We all remember the Three Musketeers. Lafayette was a musketeer. And every morning he got out to kind of meet the king, and the king would give him orders for the day. But in his memoirs, he said, that wasn't that exciting, because basically the king said, go do whatever you have to do. Whatever you did yesterday was fine. So it was more pomp and circumstances. But that was really his first introduction into the military. His father-in-law wanted him to become an officer in the French army. And at that point, the way you became an officer was not through experience or brave deeds. It all came down to money. You bought your officership. And that indeed is exactly what Lafayette did. And all of a sudden, he was an officer in the French army. And during one of his postings, his commanding officer came to like Lafayette and did two things. He introduced him to the Mason. He became a Mason. Very, very important, because who were Masons in the United States? Ben Franklin, George Washington, Jefferson, lots of people, very important people. So he had that entree even before he came here. Then in August of 1775, if I got the date right, he was invited to a dinner put on by his commanding officer, and they had a special guest. It was the Duke of Gloucester. The 7 Years' War was over. There was an uneasy truce between France and Great Britain. They still didn't particularly like each other, but the brother of the king, the Duke, came over. They had this big dinner, and Lafayette was there. And during this dinner, the Duke is saying, "Can you imagine those upstarts over in the colonies are fighting against my brother? How dare they? They want something called freedom." And you can imagine Lafayette in the back of the room saying, "Sounds good to me." And that really was kind of the kickoff when he started thinking, I need to come and help out this cause. And he started doing his own investigation. The colonist cause in France was embraced by the people. You know, they hated England because they had just lost the 7 Years' War. The American envoy Silas Deane was there trying to drum up support. France was giving him a little bit, but they didn't want to come out really too far because they had just been beaten by England. They didn't want to appear to be opposing, England outright because they couldn't take another war. So they were giving us little things like excess uniforms and weapons and a little bit of support, but nothing overtly. And the king put out an edict to everybody that was closely associated with him, including Lafayette, stay behind the scenes. We want America to win because that would mean our enemy, England, would be defeated, but we're not strong enough to take them on. This did not deter Lafayette. He had a chance really to make contact with Ben Franklin, but Franklin was so much in the forefront of our cause that he didn't want to do it. He did have some conversations with Franklin's secretary, but he spent most of his time with Deane, and Deane said, "Why don't you be a general in Washington's army?" and gave him the paperwork to become a general, the commission. Now remember, Lafayette's 19, never been in a battle in his life, but he's now a general in George Washington's army. Deane was supposed to be getting us aid. Later on, this would become a problem because Deane would have been given these commissions to everybody. I mean, we could all have been generals in George Washington's army. He just wanted people to kind of support us. So Lafayette took it. The king was dead set against him coming, but he was very much decided he was. He gathered about a dozen French officers, including a guy named DeKalb. We all know him from the road down by King of Prussia. He gets clogged every once in a while, but that's named after him. One of his other close aides was a Frenchman named Jamet, and he was helped really save Lafayette during the Battle of Brandywine. So they all get together. The king gets wind that Lafayette's going to come to America. So he sent out his troops, his guards, to go arrest Lafayette and not allow him out of the country. Does this deter our 19-year-old? Of course not. He hightailed it to Spain, and he needed a ride to America. And what do rich people do? They buy their own boat. That's what he did. He bought his own ship, supplied it, headed towards America. Lafayette really spent a lot of his fortune on us. I mean, later on, he would, supply uniforms for the troops and arms and transportation. And he really did spend a lot of his fortune. So they get to Spain. He takes off. He goes across, makes that ocean voyage, and he put his time very wisely. First of all, he decided he probably should learn English. DeKalb knew a little bit of English, so he took some English lessons. Also, if he's going to be a general, he probably should know military tactics. So we had books on military tactics he's reading as he's about to become an American general. And he spent some time also writing letters. One, very important. I love reading the old letters when I do the research, and a lot of this book, I get information right from Lafayette's memoir that were translated by members of his family. But he talks about being on the ship, and some of the papers are one very important letter that he wrote back on the ship to his wife because he forgot to inform her he was leaving. Now, the middle of the ocean, oops. And the letter, I quoted a lot out of the letter, and I usually don't do the direct quotes because it showed so much. Here was this 19-year-old ready to go fight, and he's having second thoughts. Like every other word or every other line was, and you still love me, correct? You'll be, really pleased with me. You still love me. This is a great cause I'm fighting for. But you could just tell the insecurity of him. It's a wonderful letter. He gets to South Carolina, and the military officer of the plantation he landed was also a Mason, so that kind of helped when he landed. And he wrote another letter back to his wife. And I mean, immediately as he got off the ship, he said, "This is a wonderful land. It's beautiful. It's lovely. Everybody loves each other." And I'm thinking, how many slaves and American Indians did he actually talk to before writing that? But again, it shows his exuberance and his belief in people, and a little bit of rose colored glasses. But I think this was a good point all the way through his life. From South Carolina, they were making their way to Philadelphia and talk with Congress so he could get his official commission to be the general, and he paid for transportation. The first set of carriages he got didn't really work on the roads back then, and they totally broke down. But he makes his way to Philadelphia. He knocks on that Congress's door, and what does our fine Congress tell him? Go home. We don't want you. That was because George Washington was tired of all the European officers that Dean was sending over because they didn't speak the language. They couldn't raise troops. They drained our coffers and we didn't have much money. And they disrupted the command structure of Washington's army. Here you had generals and officers been fighting for more than a year besides Washington. Then you get some, outsider coming in, doesn't know much, and they'll outrank these fighting officers. So Washington said no more. That's why Congress told Lafayette to go home. DeKalb was ready to go home the next day. He said, "Forget this. They don't want me. I'm going back to Paris." They have croissants over there. The food on the way on the ship was not very good. And Lafayette did talk about getting seasick, but he said he wasn't as seasick as some of the other officers. So DeKalb was ready to go, but our guy said, "Nope." And he went to him several times, said, "Look, I defied my king. I left my own family there. I don't want to be paid. I'm a volunteer. You got to take me in." And this came up, kept on going for a couple of days. And he had one really good benefactor, and that was Ben Franklin. And Franklin went to the Congress and said, "What are you doing? We can't beat England without assistance, especially from France. He's well known, his family in Paris. He'll be a great asset, and he has money. We're broke. What are you guys doing? Let him in. He's willing to spend money on us." So I think Congress went to Washington and said, "Look, just let him on your staff. Let him dress up in the uniform. Put him over there in the corner, and he can be the boy general, and you just keep on doing." And Washington said, "Okay." But when Washington and Lafayette first met, Lafayette said, "Where's my troops? I'm ready to fight. I'm ready to lead people." And I think Washington did a double take, went back to a member from Virginia in Congress and said, "What did you do with me?" And I think Congress had the answer they always do. And they said, your problem now, goodbye." And so Lafayette was on Washington's staff. This was in August of 1777, just a month before the Battle of Brandywine. Lafayette stayed on Washington's staff. There was another guy there you might have heard of, a guy named Hamilton. If you've seen the play, he was on that staff, and that's when Lafayette got to meet him. He observed the army, and he thought the American soldiers had great spirit, not very well disciplined, not very well, clothed, but they had great spirit. This was the time when Washington was not quite sure how British Army was doing. They all had gotten on boats and a large armada, said to be the largest in North America at that time. And they took out of New York Harbor and weren't sure where they were going. Maybe they were going up north to help Burgoyne. Maybe they were going down to Charleston to come from south to north, or maybe they were going to take Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the capital city. Back then, if you're in Europe, you lose your capital city, game's over, you lose. And everybody, I think most people thought he was going to take Philadelphia. Some other people thought not. But that's where he did. And actually, if you go back a year, when they were deciding what to do the next campaign, and remember everything was run out of England. Hal's first thought was, let's just attack Philadelphia, game over. Then after New Year's in Trenton and crossing the Delaware, he said, these guys might be a little bit stronger. Maybe we ought to all consolidate and drive north to south and just wipe them out and we'll take care of New England, which had most of the rebels anyway. He received approval for the first plan, never received a word from the second plan. So his only orders were to attack Philadelphia at that point. He really should have been up north because, of course, Burgoyne lost at Saratoga a couple days after Brandywine. So that's really where he should have been, but his orders were take Philadelphia. So he did that. He started come up with Admiral Howe, his brother. They were going to come up to Delaware. And that's where Washington first really knew what was, the game plan. The British fleet thought, with the defenses around Philadelphia, that's not going to go well. So they went back out to the Chesapeake, landed at the head of the Elk, and disembarked there. Lafayette said, we didn't oppose them, the landing. We should have opposed them, but we didn't. It was from the memoirs. He spent his birthday, September 6th, at the Hale Burns house in Delaware. They usually do something for his birthday around this time of the year. And that's when they were trying to decide how to stop the British from taking Philadelphia. Washington really didn't want to take them on head on because the British had the professional army. They were much better equipped, better trained. So he would have liked to continue doing the tactics they did in New England, kind of the hit and run and harassing them and wearing them down. But Congress said, you must make a major defense. If you don't, and they take our capital, there's no way France and Spain's going to come in on our side because we're going to look like we're pretty weak. So Washington had to find a place. When I did the first book on the Battle of Brandywine, September 11th, 1777, and I was just amazed there was no book on the battle at that point. And I think I know why. And when I did some of the research in London at the Public Records Office. And when I said I was there to do some research on the American Revolution, they said, yes, we've heard of that in that tone. And when I said the Battle of Brandywine, the people who were working there they had information that I looked at, but they didn't really know Brandywine. So here you had the British who won a major victory at Brandywine, but lost the war, so they're not talking about anything that happened here. And then you had George Washington, and we won the war, but we lost really pretty badly here at Brandywine. So he's not talking about Brandywine. So even though this was a major battle, a major part of our history, it really got kind of lost in history, I think, because of of that reason. So you had the British coming up, heading towards Kennett Square. Washington decides, and when I was doing that book, there was a rumor, and there's a lot of rumors and stories, and a lot of them aren't true, but there was supposed to have been a meeting of patriots, and they told Washington where to put his men to defend the Brandywine, and there's no way Howe could outflank him. Washington was really worried about another outflanking movement because a year before at Long Island, he got outflanked there and got whipped. So he knew that was part of the tricks of Howe, and he wanted to guard against it. After further look, I don't think that meeting ever took place. I really don't. I have not found anything, who was there, what was said, when exactly what it was. I think what happened and how Washington devised his defenses, his cartographer was in the area, did a rough sketch of the Brandywine and had like 3 or 4 fords noted, not all of them. And I think Washington used that as gospel. And when he set up the defenses here, the furthest one north was basically at Lenape, and then he went down into what is Delaware now, where Armstrong and the American militia was down that way. And that's what he used to set up the American defense. Now, on the other side, you had some loyalists. I think one was from West Callan, if I remember right, who knew the area. One of the British soldiers said he knew it like the back of his hand. And that's how they did the flanking. They went through 2 fords that were unguarded, ended up in the afternoon of September 11th on Osborne Hill, Radley Run Country Club. And that's where the afternoon's attack took place. So I think all that was going on as we're preparing for September the 11th. If we look to our guy, Lafayette, in the morning, who was he? Not many people in the Army knew him. I mean, he'd only been on Washington's staff for a couple of weeks. There's been plenty of European officers come and go. He didn't have command of any troops. So I really think if you look in the morning, he was just another staff officer. And he talks about being with Washington that morning, trying to help out. He talks about being with Washington back of the John Chadd House as the British was forming half of the army in front of him in the Brandywine. He was there and he was just doing duties. So in the morning, he was just doing that, and he wasn't like any other officer. Towards noon, if you look at some of the reports from the American staff officers, they all said Washington was really getting agitated. He couldn't figure out exactly where where Howe's army was. He was afraid of being outflanked. He was getting conflicting reports coming back from his scouts, and he was really, really agitated. And then a little bit later, the word comes back, it's verified. The British are on Osborne Hill with half the army, and they're going to come down in its back. And that was the plan of Howe. In the morning, Howe and Cornwallis took a little over half of their 15,000 troops and started that 15 mile march to get to Osborne Hill. You had the rest of the army under the Hessian Knyphausen, the general, and his orders were push the Americans back to the Brandywine, hold them there. And when you hear us attack the back, we'll come to the front, we'll get them in the middle. That'll be the end of George Washington's army. Some of the British Army officers said that was correct. If we had another 2 hours of daylight, war would have been over pretty much right here on the fields of Brandywine. It was that close. Howe's plan was working. So you had all this, you get the word comes in. General Sullivan, who had the right flank of the American army, pushed it up to Battle Hill, the Birmingham meeting house. The American units were trying to get aligned. They were having trouble. The British were coming after them. The disaster was happening. Let's go back to our just 20-year-old Lafayette. He went up to Washington and said, I want to go help. Let me go. Washington needed all the help he could. Sent him on his way with some of his French officers, including Sept that I had mentioned earlier, and they hightailed it up to the battle. Now, Lafayette's a general. He doesn't have to get off his horse. He can tell everybody what to do, and that's what generals do. That's not what Lafayette did. When he got to the battle, he found General Conway's troops. And they were positioned according to, all the information we have and the different research that's been done on the Battle of the Brandywine, just west of the Birmingham Meeting House across Birmingham Road, if you're familiar in that, in the field that now has been protected by the Brandywine Conservancy. Lafayette gets there, sees what's going on. He gets off of his horse, gets in front of Conway's brigade, trying to order them, trying to organize and a bayonet resistant charge, something, he was doing what a really good officer should do. And he's looking over his shoulder and he turns around and he sees the British coming up the hill after him. And he is shot in the left leg, doing his duty. The moment he spilled his blood, he was no longer just another European officer there to pad his resume and make money and not sincere. He put his life on his line. He spilled his blood. And that was the point when he really started becoming the American hero that helped us win the American Revolution, was just up here on the hill. His aide, Jemet, saw his blood coming out of his boot. He said, "General, we got to get you out of here, put him back on his horse." They went back to the tree line. I think it's the tree line just in back of Wiley Road, where he was treated first, and then he was taken back to Chester, where he had more treatment later that night. There's a lot of stories about Lafayette after he was wounded. One that stuck around forever was, he went back to the state park with a big spreading tree and was treated under the tree. That, of course, that's false, because the British had control of the tree right then. He was supposedly taken to the Birmingham Meeting House. That was not nonsense too, because the British that was being fought over and was under British. He went back and then he was transported and he made his way back to Chester after that. Some of the stories are great. When I was researching a book on September 11th, I heard some of the guys said, the British were so arrogant that afternoon that they stopped to make tea before charging. That sounds pretty arrogant, but I don't think that's really what happened. Tell me, if you were on a march for 14 miles and you had like an hour break while the rest of the army caught up and got in line, wouldn't you have tea and crumpets too? I mean, it's just I think they were just taking advantage. It wasn't because they were arrogant or anything. The day does turn into a disaster. Bravery, a lot of, things fought right there on Osborne Hill and General Stevens, and now at Thornbury Farm, just over the road here. But everybody held together. We got to retreat. Later that night, a message was sent to Congress. I mean, the bottom line was get out of town, but the report was, we fought well. We had to leave the field to our opponents. And he names two officers for taking part in doing great works. And one of them was Lafayette, of the two officers named back to Congress. So he makes their way back to Chester that night. And you can imagine, it's a hard day, it's fighting, you don't get much chance to eat. He's taking into this home. Another doctor is about ready to come to look at his leg wound again. They clear the table, the kitchen table, put him on as some members of Washington's staff comes in to see how he's doing. And what did Lafayette tell them? "I know you're hungry, but I'm not dinner." He's on that kitchen table. That was right from his memoirs. So just shows what type of person he is. He was taken to Philadelphia, then to Bristol for a day, and then eventually to Bethlehem, where he spent a number of weeks being treated for the leg wound. Any wound in the American Revolution was serious. You had infections, you had blood things, and even though this didn't really hit any major arteries, it was still serious. It took him a number of weeks to recover. Actually, he rejoined Washington before Valley Forge, and he wasn't completely recovered, and there's a lot of indication he should have stayed there longer. But indeed, he rejoined Washington, and this is when his reputation started to grow in the army and back in France, and he was becoming a hero back in France. And Washington was trusting him a lot more, starting to give him a little bit of assignments and troops. And at one point, he allowed Lafayette to take some men to go spy on what Howe was doing in Philadelphia. The one bit of advice by Washington, come back after 2 days, but don't camp in the same place twice, 2 nights in a row, because they'll find out and they'll capture you. Our young officer camped 2 nights in the same spot and almost was captured that second day, but he maneuvered. He had a lot of help from the Oneida Indians that were on there with him and others, and pretty much they all made it back to Valley Forge. And his reviews were mixed, as you can imagine. Some people thought he was just brilliant, got all those men back, and the other ones said, he was just kind of a lucky young guy to escape that. But he kept on building up his reputation. Also at that point, one of the reasons Washington really liked him, because he always backed him. He had Washington's back. And it wasn't like everybody was pleased with George Washington leading the American army. And 2 of them were officers Gates and Conway. Conway was the general that Lafayette fought with here in Brandywine. And there was something called the Conway Cabal. What they did, basically, they had a war board instituted in Congress that would control the operation of the war. And Gates and Conway were pretty much in charge of it. And that winter at Valley Forge was thinking, Lafayette's getting a lot of power. He's backing Washington. If we get rid of Lafayette, discredit him, that would let us take over the army. So they devised this plan, and they ordered Lafayette to attack Canada. Think about that. In the middle of the winter, attack Canada. Lafayette knew it was a problem. Washington knew it was a problem. Lafayette was not going to do it. And Washington said, you're a member of this army. You have to obey orders. But you can ask them, as a matter of fact, and they need to tell you what resources you're going to have. So Lafayette goes, and Lafayette is, by this point, has friends in Congress and writing them, and his father-in-law and the king are a little bit better. So he lets them know also that indeed, this is a bad idea. And it's not his idea. He reports to York, where the Congress is over the winter. Here I am. They tell him you're going to have extra men and money, and you're going to be full support, and go to New York and tell them where to go and get all this and go save Canada for the French. During the night that he went, they had a dinner, a lot of toasts. Everybody's taking turns. And when it came Lafayette's turn, he made everybody toast George Washington, even the Conway and Gates. And they were kind of mortified, but they had to do it. But Lafayette, after a hard trip, gets to where all of his new army and money is supposed to be. And of course, nothing. No money, no extra people, nothing. And finally, it was called off because everybody up there, a few people around saying, you're nuts, attack Canada, in January of a year during midwinter. Finally, the war board backed down. Lafayette saved face. That helped George Washington, and he was back with Washington for the rest of that campaign of that year. At the end, our guy wanted to go back to France. He wanted to see his family. He was getting accolades there. Washington was not averse to this because there wasn't going to be much fighting during the winter. And he knew once Lafayette got back, he'd be the biggest advocate for Washington's army there was. Exactly what happened. Washington went in to the king almost day after day. We got to support him more. By that point, France had recognized us as a country, but they still weren't giving us tons of support. And Lafayette was an advocate. He met Ben Franklin many times, and they devised all these great plans to invade England from there. They were just plans. Nothing ever happened from them. So Lafayette's making his way back. You got to wonder what was in his mind. He had left without telling his wife, and he had defied his king. He could very much ended up on the guillotine himself before the French Revolution for doing that. Got back, wife loved him. He was a hero there. No problems. They had another child before he came back. But you had the king. You don't just defy the king. That would loosen his power. So the king devised this awful sentence. He made Lafayette stay in his home for a week. I don't know if they had a home monitoring device on, but that was his punishment, a week in his home. So the king kind of got off. The king didn't want to do too much harsh to Lafayette because Lafayette was becoming a hero there, and that ended that. Before he went back the next year, the king finally said, "Look, I want you to go back as a French officer to Washington and tell him that I'm sending a fleet and men, and you can be the bearer of good news." Lafayette was all for that, except he was going to still remain an officer in the American Army. And he made that really clear to the king, because on the day, the last time he saw the king, he wore his American officer's uniform. I'm still an American. He goes back, tells Washington, and Lafayette does a lot of other good service, because you can imagine meshing the French Army and Navy and the Americans. There was some conflicts and language and just who's obeying who. And when there was a problem, Lafayette was always sent by Washington to go kind of smooth it out. So he was doing that. He was getting more commands. He was with Washington when Benedict Arnold tried to give away West Point. Kind of interesting what he wrote about. And Hamilton was there also. And Hamilton was ready to, charge by himself into New York City and grab Arnold by the throat right there. He talks about how upset Washington was. Really good description of that. We were having problems in the South. We needed some more leadership and men down there, and Washington sent Lafayette with a little bit of men. Anthony Wayne was supposed to get some more men to come down and help. In the South also, Wayne was having trouble organizing and recruiting men because there weren't that many around. He didn't have any money to pay them. There were some other units that had money that were paying more. So it took Wayne a long time to get down south. Washington's orders were harass Cornwallis every chance you get. Don't get into a major battle. Again, he outnumbers you. And if you find Arnold, stringing him up, forget about a trial, forget about anything else, just hang him. Of course, Benedict Arnold was the criminal of the time for betraying the army. Lafayette went south, few men, never had a chance to confront Arnold because the British didn't trust him either. I mean, if he was going to go against the Americans, he would go against the British, and they sent him to New England, then he was sent back to England for the rest of the war. Lafayette almost had a chance to confront in battle the British officer in charge of the artillery that killed his father. He was down there. But before the battle could take place, the British officer died of disease, so that never really took place. Lafayette did exactly what was told. He harassed Cornwallis, and even though Cornwallis was a stronger army, his supply base, his main supply base, was back in London. That's a long way to go. Clinton was now in charge, General Clinton in New York, and he was telling Clinton at one point, "I need more troops. I need more supplies. Come get me. I'm going to go to the coast and send the British Navy down." Lafayette stayed on the heels of Cornwallis, wrote back to Washington, who was up by New York City, and said, "Get down here with the French Army and Navy. We can corner Cornwallis and take his whole army." Washington didn't really reply because he was afraid, and we've seen stories and TV shows about the spies. He didn't want to put anything in writing in case the British would do it, but he was on his way with Rochambeau and the French army and the Navy. The French Navy came up from the Indies and was so glad that they did, because one of the major battles that doesn't get really a lot of attention, it's the Battle of the Capes. You had the British Navy coming down and the French Navy coming up, and the French Navy destroyed or won the Battle of the Capes. So Cornwallis couldn't be rescued. And by the time the British went back, refitted, and got more ships down, Yorktown had happened, and the British or the French Navy really saved us then. So we had the French Navy, we had the French Army, Washington's there, Lafayette did as he was told later to keep Cornwallis hemmed in, don't allow him to get inland, keep him at Yorktown. And on October the 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders. Lafayette played a major part in that whole campaign, last major event of the whole war, major battle of the whole war. And a couple of years later, the Treaty of Paris is signed. Lafayette is a major hero. He goes back to France. He's a major hero there. And he wants to bring American-style freedom to the French people. And the only problem was the king didn't want to go any power. And a lot of the people, the French citizenry didn't really trust Lafayette because he was associated with the king. And then we're into the French Revolution. You know, it's just horrendous. Some of Lafayette's wife's family were actually put to the guillotine. Lafayette ended up for 5 years in a Austria prison after Adrienne escaped the guillotine with the help of future President Monroe. She went to the prison with her daughters and stayed with him for a number of years, really wrecked her health. After it was all over, she died pretty early. Lafayette was left to come back, and there's a lot more to it. We got Napoleon, I'm not even going to get to, but he gets out and he gets back into French politics along with his son, who comes back from staying with George Washington during the French Revolution. They're in and out of politics. He's getting older. He's getting some of his money back, not a lot. And we're back up close to 1824. And that's when Monroe said, we're almost ready for a 50th anniversary of our country. We need a big celebration. We haven't done much for Lafayette. That's getting back as our national hero, as our guest. That's when he came back, and that's when he starts those 13 months and all those honors and parades and everything. It was just, just amazing. His secretary wrote like a book that was translated into 700 pages that talks almost day by day and different things that they did and a lot about it. And then American history, just wonderful. He went back and within the next decade, he died. He actually went to a funeral of a friend of his. It was raining. He didn't wear his hat. You know, he caught cold, and he's buried in Paris along with his wife underneath American soil. He wanted to be buried under American soil, and indeed some of the soil was brought back and put on top of his. And of course, during World War I, we had American officers go back and do the famous line, Lafayette, we have returned. After I wrote the book, I'm going to end with one little story, and then I'll take questions because I see my hours break about up in the day. After my book came out, I did a talk in Yorktown, and the owner of the bed and breakfast where I was staying, it was during the big Yorktown celebration, said, do you have one story or one piece of fact that you were doing that really means something, that you really, what's stuck in your mind? And I thought that was a good question. I thought for about a half second. I said, I'm going to tell you exactly what Lafayette liked about that whole 13 months he was here. And this comes from his secretary and the secretary's book. And it was not a formal parade. It wasn't, some politician talking. It was from an unscheduled stop in Virginia where there was a problem with his carriage. He gets out. Tavern owner sees Lafayette and his family getting out, invites Lafayette in, and puts up signs, thank you to Lafayette. And before he leaves, tavern owner says, do you have time to see my wife and my child, my son? And Lafayette said, of course. And before they left, the son just put his hand on Lafayette's shoulder and said, thank you. Thank you for our freedom. I just think that's just the greatest story. And, it's emotional to me every time I say it, and I've said it a number of times, but that really kind of encapsulates who he was and why we honor him and why we should continue to honor him. Questions? Anybody? Anyone? Yeah.
Which, French military tactics, British military tactics, because certainly I was active at the time it was American, no, American military tactics.
Yeah.
Based in its history, tactics, different things we're watching.
Good question. What kind of tactics you read coming over, and also, how was his leadership, did it mesh with George Washington? I think it definitely had to be French military tactics coming over. All the books they had were French. So there were other French officers there. So, I never saw exactly what he studied, but I'm almost sure it had to be the French. And when he got here, at first he did not get command, and it would be months and months and months. So, he was on Washington's staff, he was observing, he was seeing, and at Valley Forge, we had the Baron von Steuben came over, and he really taught tactics, and Lafayette was there. So I think this was a learning process that he became immersed with, along with a lot of the other English-speaking American officers that kind of developed as they went. Because von Steuben did a lot to bring us into a professional army. So I think it was very much a learning process. Dave? He is one of the American citizens. Congress named him, and I forget what year, but it was like the late 1800s or early 1900s. He was. There's stamps, made in his honor. There's just so much through a history, and it's just a shame we don't teach history as much as we should, and because Lafayette really gets lost. Since I've been giving you the book and part of the American Friends of Lafayette, as soon as I tell people, I say, "Oh yeah, there's that painting in Richmond and the Capitol." When I was in New York City, I saw 3 or 4 paintings of Lafayette's or statues of Lafayette's or Lafayette Street. This came from Fayetteville, North Carolina, Lafayette, Fayetteville. That came from down there. There's Fayette County here. There's a college, Lafayette College, that was named for him, and the name came during that 1824, 1825 visit is when they named the college for him. So he used to be so big around, and it's kind of dropped off with all of our history in past years. When he went back from his 1825 in September to go back, the American Navy had a new ship ready to take him back. I always like that because the name of the ship is the Brandywine, named after the battle. And if you look at some of the book by a secretary, Lafayette and Brandywine are really intertwined together during that trip. When I started to do the book on Lafayette, I was doing research. I contacted the American Friends, and there are a number of books out there on different aspects of his life and biographies and different things. And one of their questions was, what makes it different? And I told him about Brandywine, and really could be used to kick off his whole life and everything. And, he's really was the hero. It started off Brandywine. And their initial response was to laugh at me. Can you imagine that? They just laughed. And the reason they were laughing, they said, what took it so long for you guys at Brandywine to realize Lafayette is the story of Brandywine? His wounding was really what catapulted and helped us win. And they were right. I mean, if you look at everything that's been written, including my first book, I had him there, he was wounded, but to really put him together that this was the place where it started it all. That it kind of hinted at, I found it here and there, but nobody's really said, this was the making of the American hero. Yeah. Sure, I love it. The good group. Yes. Yeah, and the question is, after your visit, it kind of brought to the Masonic table, how important was that Masonic connection? I think it was very important. And actually, I've gotten that tour down there. I've given talks on Lafayette because of Lafayette Masonic connection, and there's busts of Lafayette in the temple and everything. I think network, let's put it this way, networking, as we go through our lives, business or professional, you meet good friends, you have people in the business profession that can help you. I think this was probably, the biggest one, because all of a sudden he had a network of, people in government and people in the army and people he could help. And that first military officer, when he stepped off the boat in, South Carolina and Franklin here, I think, it was a very big connection, that it was like-minded people of power, and he was part of it. Dave?
How did the monument to the government raised up here in the fall?
There is a monument up there, and I don't argue with people who say, no, that's the spot he was wounded. It's not. In the 1920s, and it was really great. Some school kids from around here raised money, got their pennies for this monument, and that was a piece of land that it was available. So I think a little bit was there, and it was in the woods where he was treated first. I don't think it's the exact spot, but it's in the woods. So I think whoever owned the land did it. The kids raised the money, and that's how it kind of landed there. I'm glad they did and honor it. It's now on private property, and it's not easy to get to. But yeah, a lot of people, I talked to one guy, one of my thought, he was adamant that's where he was wounded, but he was wounded in front of Conway's troops, and that's very evident from Lafayette's memoirs and other writings of other officers. That's where he was when he was wounded. I can't tell you the exact blade of grass. I've had people ask me. Yeah. He came back to visit Washington after the American Revolution and spent some time at Mount Vernon. And every report I had, they were like father and son. They spent days. They, just that really close relationship. When he came back for the tour in 1824 and 25, he visited Washington's grave there at Mount Vernon. So I think it's just a great relationship all the way through. No, that's an American uniform. Yeah.
Not British, I'm sorry, French. Because of the,
It does look like it. I thought it was an American, but I'm not 100% sure. So I will do some research. Yeah. Yeah. But also he bought and tailored his own uniforms. So they weren't like they were mass produced and kind of came out, but I'm not sure. A little bit, yeah. You paid for it, you can buy it. I mean, it's not like today. Remember, we're talking the 1770s, and a lot, and most of the soldiers didn't have uniforms. Yep. Yep, that's a good question. That's a famous painting. I'll find out when it was painted and who did it. The illustrations used a lot.
You can't tell whether they're eagles or the.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
It was an exceptional. talk.
Well, no, I'm glad. Thank you all for coming.
Bruce will be in the back selling his books. I'm sure he'd be happy to autograph them for you. There's other books, the township history book, and Steve, what was that? Oh, meal. Yeah. I'm not sure when our next historical lecture will be, but we'll certainly publicize it soon. Okay. Very good. Well, thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you at